the school system. And so to make sure that I'm covering both sides, I'm going to speak to both of you at the same time. So as we go through this, I'll talk about defense attorneys for defendants and attorneys for plaintiffs, so that you understand that we want to talk to both groups of attorneys. So we're going to talk about special needs students, and this is a critical issue. The reason why it's so important is that over the last 5 years, in particular, there has been an incredible growth in K-12 students with special needs. And we're not going to get into, in this session, we're not going to get into the causes of that, but there's a lot of myth and a lot of misunderstanding and, frankly, a lot of bad scientific research talking about the causes. And the thing is that we want to make sure that whatever information that we give you today is critical to the work that you are doing. So I'm going to stay focused on our point, which is the management of these special needs students. But suffice it to say, there has been this incredible growth, and what's happening now is that the U.S. Department of Education is estimating additional growth over the next 3 years, which is going to shoot down the estimate they made 5 years ago. It's growing geometrically, and so this is an important issue for anyone who's dealing with the legal issues of a school system, or again representing students or staff. The fast-growing student disability currently is autism. And autism is a confusing condition. It has a spectrum, and so I want to explain things in very simple terms so that you understand them. If you already know this, forgive me, but I want to make sure everybody understands the terms and current information on this. So autism has a spectrum. So Asperger's syndrome would be the low spectrum. These would be functioning people. In fact, the most famous person that I know of with Asperger's is Dan Aykroyd. And so autism goes to a severe spectrum where children basically can't even go to school. They have to be in special programs with 24-hour care. And again, there are there's a lot of theories about what causes it and why we've had such a great increase in it. But the bottom line is that these children are really the fastest growing group. Then you have another group, which is children who are bipolar. The problem is that the manifestation of these conditions, and I'm talking first about mental type conditions, and then I'll talk about physical. The problem with bipolar is that it generally is not diagnosed until adolescence. It's hard to diagnose before that point. And most people, on average, in the United States are not diagnosed until they're in their 20s. Ironically, early 20s, mid-20s is the same time when people manifest other mental conditions like schizophrenia. And one of the things that we want to also make sure that you know as attorneys is a general understanding of this, and it's important that this is not the end-all training for special needs students. We're going to focus on management and security and safety issues, but bottom line is this is something you want to spend some time researching so you understand it. Really, on a monthly basis, new information comes out all the time. Juveniles account for 1/3 of all sex offenders in the United States. Female juveniles are the fastest growing group of sex offenders. Now, why would I mention sex offenders? Because in schools, according to the U.S. Department of Education, the Justice Department, the majority of sex assaults against students are done by special education students and generally against special education students. And so the sex assault issue is a very key element, and because I work in forensics and I teach for the federal government, this has been on our radar for the past 4 or 5 years, this incredibly skyrocketing aspect of juvenile females who first offend, by the way, when they babysit. Male sex offenders who are juveniles in adolescence have pretty much plateaued, And the second biggest group, just for informational purposes, are married Caucasian women between the ages of 30 and 50. Now, why do I bring up that statistic? Well, it's very important because if you look at the sex assault rates between staff and students in schools, both public and private, you'll find that in the last 3 years, it's been heavily towards the female side. And so one thing that you don't want to do as a legal professional, as an attorney, is to bring your own personal bias into this. You want to make sure you stay clear-headed. You want to have a clear perspective on what's going on. And so, you know, when we look at special needs students within schools, we're really talking about really a microcosm of what's going on in society. And not just in the U.S., we see this even greater in Canada. So if any of you happen to be connected in any way, because we work in Canada, but if you're connected in any way to attorneys in Canada, Canada actually has twice as much juvenile crime as we do, and about 1/3 our population. In fact, they have much higher rates of certain crimes than we do. There's a lot of myth about what's going on there, and the schools that we work with in Canada are just having a horrible time trying to manage this because they're having the same problems. And across the world, we work in other countries, and we see the same problems with special needs children in other countries because it's a biological issue, it's a social issue, an issue of technology. There are many factors here. But it's important that we get the facts and we understand what's really going on. It's so, so important. So, as we talk about these issues of, sorry about that, I hit the wrong button. As we talk about these issues, one thing I do want to bring up is another statistic as we go into IDEA, and that is that in the United States every year, 2.2 million crimes are committed in schools. Of that 2.2 million crimes, about 73%, 74% of those crimes are committed in suburban and rural schools. And this is an important piece of information for those of you who are attorneys, whether you're representing a school or a school system, or you are a plaintiff's attorney who does education law. It's important that you understand that this is not a city problem, and it has never been a city problem. In fact, sexual assault of juveniles in school, which is about 240,000 a year, again, 60%, the majority of it is in suburban and rural schools. So what happens is that urban schools are basically fighting what they consider to be a war on a daily basis, trying to keep the bad guys out, trying to deal with gangs, trying to deal with violent situations and violent crime. And suburban and rural schools have an attitude that things don't happen here. Well, the problem is that they don't really know what's happening because they don't have a formal process to understand that. And so Sandy Hook is a critical crime to talk about this issue of special needs children, and I'm going to refer to Sandy Hook throughout this. As subject matter expert for the Justice Department, one of the things that I had to do when Sandy Hook occurred a little over a year ago was to brief law enforcement on that because I train senior level law enforcement in Connecticut. And one of the things we started to do is start asking the right questions because the media was not asking the right questions. They didn't understand how schools work. They didn't understand education law on a federal or state level, and they really weren't asking the difficult questions. We started to ask those questions and found some interesting things, which I'll be sharing with you. But one of the things you'll notice, sadly, when you heard about the shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary, as they interviewed parents, you heard them say this over and over again. We moved from the big city to get away from the crime. The problem is that's a myth, and it's always been a myth. In fact, let me give you a statistic that helps reiterate my point. In Orange County, New York, which is where the TV show Orange County Choppers is, Orange County, New York, which is semi-rural, there are twice as many sex offenders as compared to the whole city of Manhattan, the whole borough of Manhattan. And so sex offenders don't stay in cities generally. They move out to rural areas and suburban areas. And the thing is that people are basing their decisions in schools, and I'm talking about leadership. In the case of Sandy Hook, you had a lack of leadership, and I will defend my point because it's important that we use Sandy Hook as an educational example, as an educational tool in this process. The evidence is very clear from what we've gathered that the failure of the school board and the superintendent to manage the school and to follow federal law contributed greatly to this shooting, and I'll be talking about that more as we go through it. But one of the problems is the attitude. So if you're an attorney and you are dealing with a school district that is suburban or rural, chances are you're dealing with people that believe that crime's not happening here. If you're an attorney who represents a school system and is a rural or suburban school system, that attitude is going to create a liability problem and create a nightmare for that school system because that attitude is not accurate. People do not understand in the United States where crime occurs, and it is not an urban problem, believe me. It's something I deal with on a daily basis. Secondly, some of you may know who Dr. Peter Drucker was. Peter Drucker was the man who invented modern management back in the early part of the 20th century. Most of you have had titles like CEO, president, vice president. Those titles were created by him as part of a process that eventually became IBM and various corporations. He was a very, very important man in the history of management. And one of the things that I am very honored to have done is been his student for 15 years. And one of the things that Dr. Drucker used to say to us he said it a lot, we manage what we can measure. And one of the problems in the management of special needs children is that schools do not have a formal measuring process, a formal analysis process. In the United States, under IDEA, under federal education law, under NCLB, you are required as a school system, as an LEA, I'm going to define some of these terms for you. Again, if you know them already, I apologize, but an LEA is a local education agency. So a school district or a school would be an LEA. And under federal law, an LEA is required to do a climate assessment of its special education department. And you are not allowed to do your own climate assessment of your special education department. And this is a problem because most school districts have never done that climate assessment. In other words, assessing whether your policies that oversee that special ed department in your school system meet the federal law standards. And this is where we see a lot of weakness. And so as we go into this process, I want you to remember that statement from Dr. Drucker. We manage what we can measure. You cannot manage a school system if you have never measured what is working and what is not from a safety or emergency management perspective or from a management perspective in general, talking about classroom management. It's important that there be a formal process, and a checklist is not a formal process. And a formal process has to be done by people that actually have done that work, have done that work and know the law. So IDEA is Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So IDEA is a federal law that came out of ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act. And I'll talk later about the connection between the two of them because it's very important. When there's a change in ADA, that affects IDEA. And as you all know, as attorneys, federal law trumps state law. And we're going to talk later about some of the problems with the conflict between the two. So IDEA staff and administrators are unaware of changes in discipline rules. One of the things that really surprises me and frankly makes me angry as a professional, and I think it should make you angry as professionals, is when I talk to board attorneys or I talk to school board members specifically or superintendents, and you know, we have 30,000 school clients in the U.S., so I'm talking to at least 10 superintendents a week and probably another 20 school board members a week. And when I ask them about the changes, what have you done to include all of the new changes in ADA that occurred, they don't know anything about it. And so the first rule I would say that's very important as an attorney who is representing and ultimately protecting a school system is that you need to be current on these law changes because they are critically important. Secondly, it's very important to make sure that your director of special education is actually aware of these changes. We find that a lot of schools, when we work on legal cases, have not updated their policies and that special ed directors are not current with federal education law. They're a year behind, some cases 2 years behind. They don't know what's going on, and things are changing. There were changes made in September of 2012, and then after Sandy Hook, there were changes made and revisions made. There were revisions done pretty much on a regular basis. What happened last year, though, that made IDEA very important because, again, IDEA has a Part A, a Part B. Part B is the one that deals with K-12, basically. One of the, and also people into their early 20s. But one of the things that occurred was after Sandy Hook, there was an effort to deal with special education type law and regulations, and there were some provisions done, some modifications done, because Arne Duncan, the Secretary of Education, and the President decided that regarding No Child Left Behind, which also plays into this, by the way, so we have No Child Left Behind, we have IDEA, and we have ADA, all interconnecting with each other regarding the students in the schools. One of the things that occurred was that Arne Duncan told the school districts that they would, the state education departments of education in each state, that they would be responsible for compliance with NCLB regulations. And part of that was a deal that was struck by the government with states to allow them to basically extend when they were required to be compliant with NCLB. Because the deal was struck by Congress because last year was the first milestone year, and then this year would have been the second milestone year for NCLB compliance. And so they cut a deal, and they allowed the state departments of education to oversee compliance by their school systems. Well, let me tell you that caused a lot of chaos because most of the state departments of education were not staffed or up to speed to be able to handle that compliance for their school systems. And ultimately what that means is a lack of a reduction in federal funding. But we're not talking about that today. What it really, really creates is a situation where, for example, in the state of New Jersey, there is the IDEA, which is federal law, and then there is HIB. So HIB is harassment, intimidation, and bullying. When this law came about several years ago, I was at the statewide meeting. I was a speaker at the statewide meeting where it was introduced to superintendents to their frustration. And one of the things that came up was, well, what about IDEA? And the problem with the New Jersey HIV law, the HIB law, is that it violates various aspects of federal law, including a Supreme Court decision in the 1980s about juveniles. And so there's been a great deal of battling going back and forth in D.C. over what to do about that. Some want it left alone, and some people in the Justice Department want to challenge, and the Department of Ed want to challenge that New Jersey law because it has pieces that are unconstitutional. What it's creating in New Jersey, which is very important for all of you to know, even if you work in other states, what's creating in New Jersey is a conflict where plaintiff attorneys who represent special needs children who are suing schools or LEAs are using that by going to federal court and filing civil rights cases on a federal level. We see more and more of this happening over the last 24 months where plaintiff attorneys who sue school systems aren't doing it in the typical manner on a local level or a county level or superior court in the state. They're going to federal level. When a federal level lawsuit is filed, the Justice Department has had a policy for about 4 years now that they monitor and follow those types of cases regarding children. And that creates a lot of stress on everybody because they are looking for civil rights violations, which IDEA covers. And so there's a lot, just for background purposes, I know I'm throwing out a lot of acronyms, but it's very important to understand what's been going on in D.C. that affects your states, because federal law, again, trumps state law, and as we'll talk more about this, that there's state law that conflicts with federal law. Procedural safeguards. One of the things that is a problem that we see constantly is that there are no procedural safeguards in place to make sure that people do not violate this federal IDEA law when it comes to the management of children, of special needs children. So, for example, let me give one example, is when you discipline a special needs child, there are very specific rules within IDEA of how to do that. And one of the things that, one of the pieces of it is a phrase that you probably are familiar with, which is positive behavioral interventions and supports. Now, part of that is an IEP, Individual Education Plan. I have seen more school districts lose civil cases over a bad IEP than anything else. And if Andy was here, he would say an amen to that. If you don't understand IDEA, and if your staff doesn't understand it, and if your special ed director doesn't understand the law, they will design IEPs that violate that federal law. Now, on a moral basis, I'm going to leave legal right now and talk about morality for a minute. On a moral basis, it doesn't help the child get an education. It actually hurts them to have a poorly designed or improperly designed individual education plan, IEP. But from a legal perspective, it is a violation of federal law. And the Justice Department has been indicting people for violation of this law. They are not as forgiving as the Department of Ed is in Washington, and they have indicted people, and it has been going on. And so procedural safeguards means that you're going to look at all the process that IDEA lays out. For example, discipline. Discipline is another area where lawsuits come about because either a special needs student was not disciplined correctly, or they were disciplined too harshly and violated the discipline that was provided was a violation of federal law. For example, you have a series of removals. For example, you have certain patterns of behavior with a student. So remorse, this can actually be considered by the school system, history of discipline, cognitive function, understanding the difference between right and wrong. And then if there's a series of removals, a series of removals under IDEA means that they've been removed for 10 school days in a school year. And then what can be considered is a length of removal and the closest of those removals. All of that can be factored into how discipline is meted out to a special needs student. It is complicated. It's hard to even explain it in simple terms. That's why you need to make sure, as an attorney who represents a school, that you sit down with the law, with IDEA, as it is currently administered from Washington, with your special ed director, with your key leadership people, and go through it with a fine-tooth comb and make sure that the procedural safeguards are in place, that your teachers, that your special ed director, your principal, no one is going to violate those rules when it comes to disciplining that student. I have personally sat in IEP meetings where I just shook my head. I was just embarrassed to be there with people that should have been professional, should have known what the law said. I wasn't allowed to speak in there because I was in there as a representative of the federal government, but I watched them just break rule after rule in the IEP process. So procedural safeguards can only be done if you have an assessment done first of your special ed department. And if you're an attorney who has an action against the school system or you're thinking about taking that action, this is a key element to look at, is do they have procedural safeguards in place to protect against violation of this federal law?
And are they written down, and are people held to that? And ultimately, it's the management of people that keeps you from lawsuits, keeps you from litigation.
Dale,
next, local school policy.
As you're speaking, a couple of questions have occurred to me. So do you mind if I ask them now?
Oh, please, please.
Okay. I thought that might add to the conversation. Once a child receives an IEP, how often is the child followed up on? Is that discussed or during the IEP, or is that something that is standardized?
Well, it's standardized because once you have an IEP, the IEP is based on a function behavioral assessment. So this is an assessment that has to be done of the child, and then you have to revisit the IEP if there's discipline issues, if they're not progressing in their learning, and that's all part of a process called manifestation determination, and that's something we're going to talk about in a moment. But yes, it's done on a fairly regular basis, and it can also, under IDEA, be done on an emergency basis when there's a discipline issue with the student, or the student is not progressing educationally. And so it's important to understand that process. And so in answer to your question, yeah, it's something that's done routinely. It's part of the process of the law.
Now, and what's the trigger for an IEP? Is it triggered by the parents, or can anyone request it? How does that process?
Well, I was going to talk about that fairly soon, but I'll do it now. First of all, here's the situation. A parent, under the law, a parent has to express concern about their child's learning process or a possible disability in writing, can't be verbal, and that has to be submitted to a teacher, or it has to be submitted to the special ed director. Normally it's the special ed director that has to receive that through a principal. So here's the situation. A teacher, a school is held responsible for for assessing the child, for doing an assessment of the child if a teacher or other personnel have expressed concern about that child and the possibility of some type of special need. Now, that brings up Sandy Hook. Recently, in the last few weeks, documents were leaked that show that teachers, that's plural, teachers, were concerned about violent behavior by Adam Lanza, his learning disability, and we also know personally, because we did some investigating on this, there is evidence that the school district possibly, I have to say that legally, but it is possible, and we allege that the mother, from sources that we talked to, did write a letter and possibly a second letter asking for Adam to be evaluated, and he was never evaluated, which is a major violation of IDEA. And I will tell you that having done this work for 25 years, I believe that alone would have stopped the shooting. And I'll tell you why. Had he been evaluated, because everybody was guessing at what his conditions were, after his death, had he been evaluated, he would have had an IEP. There would have been actions taken, including the assignment of Adam to a social worker to oversee him, and that social worker, that would have been, under IDEA, would have continued into his early 20s. So he wouldn't have been socially isolated. There's a lot of things the public, a lot of things professionals don't know about that family, about what really happened behind the scenes. But I will tell you that alone, in my professional opinion, would have stopped it, because he wouldn't have been isolated. And so there's only one way that a school district or an LEA is not held responsible for a child's special needs, and that's if the parent has refused an evaluation or refused services for the child. This is a very serious problem that's been going on for a long time. There are parents that refuse to allow their children to be assessed. This is a problem for educators because they see the child struggling and suffering, and if the child was evaluated, they would know exactly what the issues are, and they'd be able to help that child. But the problem is you have parents who will not allow that to happen. We find that parents who are lower income are more likely to do that, and also parents who are college educated and upper middle and upper income also make up a group of people that do not want evaluations done on their children. And so that alone, that refusal by the parent, would prevent the child from being evaluated, and it lets the LEA off the hook, at least legally. But that's even though it's a problem, it's not as common as you would think. So hopefully that answered the questions that you had. All right. So I'm going to move forward on this. Next.
Yes. Thank you very much, Andy.
Oh.
And we are, just so you know, we are asking for anyone to submit their questions to please do so in the chat feature. And you know what, while I'm online at this time, I'm going to ask that the attendees please type in the passcode for today so that we can verify your attendance if you're seeking CLE credit. Thank you. So there you go, Andy. Or I'm sorry, Dale, it's back to you now.
Okay. So the next issue is a management issue. And again, you know, the quote that really is the theme of this training is Dr. Drucker's quote, "We manage what we can measure." You can't manage something if you don't have a measuring ruler. You have to be able to understand the numbers. Decisions have to be based on data, not assumption. It would probably surprise most of you to know that schools make up an awful lot when it comes to security and emergency management, and especially for special education children. The day of the Sandy Hook shooting, I was in the ABC News studios, and I was handed by ABC News a copy of the emergency plan for Newtown. And I will tell you that after doing this for as long as I have, I was really angry, there's no other word for it, how poorly designed this emergency plan was. One of the things I zeroed in on right away was the lack of prediction and prevention training or policies. Everything was reactionary after the fact. Emergency plans do not stop crimes. They clean up after the crime. And so there was nothing in there. There was no safety plan to predict and prevent. But even worse, the section dealing with special needs children was only dealing with mobility issues. You know, the child in the wheelchair, the child that couldn't move very well. And the problem is that, and we'll talk about this later, is this issue of the students being managed who have special needs, and those special needs that are mental conditions or mental illnesses, and the problems that causes. But I was just angry and saddened by how poorly designed that was. And I've said this many times publicly that we really haven't made a whole lot of progress since Columbine, and we haven't made much progress since Sandy Hook. And people are shocked to hear that, but, you know, we're on the ground. We see this on a daily basis. So let's talk about this management issue. Special education staff are generally not trained in the emergency management of special needs students. So if you're a parent, and you had a small, when your children were small, and they weighed maybe, 30 pounds, 40 pounds, when they didn't want to get off the floor, and they laid there in a tantrum or in a fetal position, trying to pick up a child that doesn't want to move, that 40 pounds feels like 400 pounds. And the problem is that because of autism and other mental conditions, these children will panic and they will freeze and in some cases they will become violent. Standard emergency management training does not cut it when it comes to special needs children, and very few. And I will go out on a limb and say that I estimate that less than 5% of all the schools, public and private, in the U.S. have done specialty emergency management training for their special education teams. And the fact, and some of you may say, well, wait a minute, Dale, if they're special education teachers, they certainly know how to handle those students, not in an emergency. It's a whole different thing. Teaching them and managing them when they are scared is completely different, and most schools have no training whatsoever. You have to be able to talk to their unconscious mind, and that takes skill. That is something that you have to learn. You have to practice to be able to talk to them, get them to trust you, calm down, to get refocused, because the condition of autism, for example, it's very hard for them to read emotion. In bipolar, stress, most bipolar conditions are stress-related. ADHD, that alone is self-explanatory when it comes to managing children when they're scared and they have a hard time concentrating and focusing. The mobility issue is something that's been well-defined. Children who are in wheelchairs, children that have some type of physical condition that restricts their mobility, that's been well-defined for the past 20 years, how you do that with those children. In fact, most fire rescue can train schools on how to handle that, but not the mental conditions. Emergency plans are lacking, like the one at Newtown. They don't discuss this. They don't deal with this issue of how do I manage these children. And if you think that just the school special ed teachers are going to be able to handle all of those students, that's not reality. You're going to have to train other staff members, and they're going to have to know that when there's a major emergency, they have to come down and assist the special education people. If you're an attorney who's a plaintiff attorney who represents students, this is a key area to look at when you file a lawsuit. Are they being progressive in the way they put their policies together for emergency management and the safety of those students? Policy updates. Every state that I know of all 50 states, and I think also Puerto Rico, requires on a yearly basis that the school systems sit down with their emergency plans and their safety plans, review them, and update them. And I will tell you that my experience is that most of them never do that. That's a violation of state law. It is something recommended, but not required by federal, by the Department of Ed and the Justice Department, unless you have a grant. There's certain grants that you can get from the federal government that require you to update your emergency plan and safety plan, but states have this in place. They've had it in place since Columbine. If you're an attorney who represents a school system, this is a critical area that you need to focus on. Are they updating it every year and keeping in compliance? If you're an attorney, if you're a plaintiff attorney, this is an area to look at. Policy updates are really, really important. Poor management of students, this is the real problem. So, under the IEP, which is the Individual Education Plan, you have Behavioral Manifestation Determination, what we call the BMD. And I will tell you that process, which I talked about earlier, where parents, if they in writing say, I have a concern about my child, or a teacher or any LEA personnel, anybody who works in that school system, if they show a concern, the school system is required by federal law to make a determination. And what they're making is a determination of doing an evaluation. In simple terms, an evaluation, which is outlined in IDEA, how that's done, to determine what the issues are with that child as it relates to learning and their functionality within the school. This is where a lot of things fall apart. You have people in schools that are not qualified to do these. You have them being done, and they're violating the outline, what's outlined in the IDEA. Again, you can't assume that your special education director is doing the right things, that they know what's going on. you have to have an assessment done of that department to make sure they are compliant and they are doing all of these things. The information disconnect. In many cases, violent crime occurs, and that's something where you can take a special needs child out of that school and put them in an alternative school if there's drugs, a firearm, or bodily injury. And these things are clearly outlined in IDEA. There's a limitation to how long you can do that, 45 school days. But the bottom line is that people sometimes tell me today, I've heard it actually last week, oh, you can't discipline special needs children the way you do regular children, and that's absolutely not true, and it has been true for well over 3 years. There's the information disconnect. Is the director of special education and the special ed teachers, are they being trained and kept up to speed with what they're allowed to do? And most importantly, is the school policy current? And where does school policy come from? Well, those of you who are not familiar with schools, school policy comes from the school board. So in all 50 states, school boards make policy. Superintendents carry out that policy from the board, and then principals and department heads and all of that. And so it's important to look and analyze and do these climate assessments and determine, are we current? Are we doing what we're supposed to do? The next thing is core assessments, physical disability versus personality disorder. So let me explain this very quickly. A personality disorder is sociopathic, psychopathic behavior. This is behavior where a child is not mentally ill. They don't have a physical defect. What they have is a personality disorder that makes them aggressive, violent, usually criminal in their behavior. A physical disability, there is a physical aspect to that disability. So in mobility, it could be spina bifida. In a mental situation, it would be autism, something they were born with, something that is a physical defect of the brain. And what's happening now is that there is a great deal of movement among plaintiff attorneys to start challenging the party line when it comes to the difference between these two. Because when schools are having these meetings and IEP meetings with parents, and parents disagree with the determination, the behavioral manifestation determination, what's happening is that the attorneys, when the lawsuits are filed, are saying, wait a minute, I have psychologists and psychiatrists who will refute, your categorization. And this is a weak point in IDEA because it doesn't clearly define it as well as it should. And so poor assessment can get you into trouble. And if you're an attorney who is a plaintiff attorney, this is an area to look at. Next, parents and disability assessments. Again, not my child. This is handled. We teach management, education management, and one of the things that Andy teaches is how to win over parents so that they will drop their defenses and allow their child to be assessed, which is not the case in Sandy Hook from what we can determine. The mother was wanting an assessment done, and the school dropped the ball and didn't do it, and they frankly should be ashamed of themselves. So what I'm going to do now is part of the learning process is to answer any questions you have. If I can't answer a question, I'm pretty versed on this, but if I can't answer a question, I will make sure that through TASA, we will make arrangements for you to talk to Andy or one of our other experts to clarify any questions that you have. So,
okay.
Do you have any questions out there?
We do, Dale. We have a few questions for you. And this question is from Cindy. What happens when a parent requests a special education evaluation after their child, who is in a 504 plan at the time, made a threat to school campus and the LEA evaluates and determines that the child is not eligible for IDA services?
Well, okay. Well, that's a complicated question. Any time a threat happens, so under IDEA, drugs, weapons, or serious bodily harm kicks in a very radical placement, which is to an alternative education facility. But threats are handled as under IDEA as being allowed to be handled by the local LEA head people who are looking at that child's situation, but they can't. What you're saying in the question doesn't make any legal sense, because if they've done a manifestation determination, they've done the assessment, they've determined this child has something that a condition that obviously meets the IDEA standards, because of a threat, they can't just deny that. Wouldn't shock me, but that there's no legal basis to that if I understand the question correctly. So.
Okay, let me go back up to the question then.
Okay.
Well, when we refer to the 504 plan, what is that?
Well, there are different levels of plans for IEPs, and it all depends on, there's actually there's a Part C to IDEA. This is one of those questions that I wish Andy was here for. But the issue is, let's clean up the branches on this and get down to the basics. If the child had a assessment done and a determination was made that they have a mental or physical disability that is listed with IDEA, they can't retroactively go back as a school district and just take that protection off the child. I have seen it happen, but it's illegal. So that would be my answer to your question. But I would need to. This is something where after the webinar, we need to get Andy involved in the details. I mean, that's why we're here. We're experts in this area, but Andy does the detail work on this, and he would need to address that, the specifics. But I know IDEA, and I know that that's not legally allowed unless I'm missing something in the data.
Okay. Here's the next question. This is really an opinion question. Why do you think there's been such an increase in school shootings?
Well, actually, we actually do not lead the world in school shootings. Let's get some facts out there.
Okay.
There are actually more school shootings in Australia and Western Europe, specifically Germany and those countries, than there are in the United States. You can actually look this up. So we're not number one in the world for that. Number two is, the issue of school shootings is really about a public suicide. So when I was training with the Justice Department, this was back in the days of Luby's Cafe. Some of you remember that shooting in a restaurant in Texas. And it started a whole decade of public shootings, including the ones you saw or heard about at the post office, where postal workers were going postal. And we started looking at it and realizing that these were people who wanted to commit suicide, but they wanted to do a public suicide. In other words, they wanted to take other people with them before they killed themselves. They didn't want to do it quietly and privately. They wouldn't do it publicly. They were angry. And not to get into too much forensic psychology, but suicide is a narcissistic act. It's why it's illegal in all 50 states. You're not allowed to commit suicide or attempt to commit suicide. Not that anybody ever gets charged with it, but you have to understand that we have a great number, and this is my professional opinion, not my personal opinion. We have a great number of dysfunctional families in this country over the last, I would say, 15 years, and they are growing at a rapid rate. And you have a lot of children who are incredibly depressed and angry. And one of the things that we notice is that, when you look at the research on bipolar, so manic depression, it used to be called manic depression, the modern term is bipolar, the best research right now points to one potential cause, and that is these children are not born that way. This is created from trauma around the age of 3, 4, or 5. Now again, this is not definitive, but the idea that it's genetic, like schizophrenia or some other mental condition, is just not supported by the data. And I've read every one of these research documents. And the best research I've seen, there's several of them that they are tentatively saying that it is trauma related. Well, where is that trauma coming from? Dysfunctional families. And I see it constantly because I deal with juvenile sex offenders. Most of my criminal work is sex offenders, both juvenile and adults, and I see this. And I see the kind of family life that they have. And I will tell you that most of these families are quote-unquote good families. You know, middle class, upper middle class, some college education or college educated. These are not poor people. And the thing is that you have a lot of adults, in my professional opinion, who are not acting like mature adults, and they're using their children as cannon fodder for their bad behavior. And these kids eventually get fed up with it, and it depresses them, and it makes them feel insecure, and they get angry. And I will also further say, in my professional opinion, that the idea that bullying causes suicide is absolutely not true. That's my professional opinion. You can disagree if you want. I've looked at this. I've studied the suicides of teenagers. They were talking suicide or thinking suicide long before they were bullied. Bullying may be the last straw, but it was not the cause. The cause is family-oriented. And that's my answer to your question. Not that it's a happy answer, but that's my answer. So.
Okay. I do have a question here from Paige, and she asks, could you further explain the physical disability versus personality disorder differential? If you could just kind of speak to that again.
So you may have heard of a child having behavioral issues. Mm-hmm. So a behavioral issue doesn't likes to pick on kids, likes to grab their food off their tray. That is a personality disorder. Personality disorders are learned behaviors, always from a caregiver or a parent, and they are negative behaviors. I mean, they, on a minor level, it's pushing and shoving, stealing, but on a major level, it's crime. It's violent crime. A mental condition that would be a mental illness, there has to be a defect of the brain. So just like a physical disability would have to have a defect. I have a brother who is hearing impaired since birth. He's been deaf since birth. He has a physical defect. That is how they are categorized. The problem is, in education, you have, and I was taught this way, we were taught a lot of Carl Rogers and Maslow. And the problem is that these are theories about human behavior that actually were disproven empirically, scientifically, but they are still in use today, and judges accept it as the way to understand human behavior. And the problem is that they are seriously flawed, and that's what's coming into effect, where you have plaintiff attorneys who are saying, "Whoa, we don't accept your definition of what is a mental condition and what is a personality disorder. We have our own experts that disagree with what theories you're using," because that's the problem, is that for legal purposes you have a lot of consensus science, which is problem for me. I think science can be proven with empirical data, not consensus. And so that's really what's happening, is these definitions, how we define it in forensics is radically different than what a general psychologist would define it as. And that's the debate going back and forth. And generally the general psychologists and sociologists win that battle on a legal basis. But again, in the last couple of years, it's being challenged. And we're going to see it continue to be challenged as a matter of fact. So hopefully that gives you a basic answer to that question.
Okay, and then Paige has a follow-up. Yes, I do. Paige has a follow-up question, and she asks, can you recommend some type of comprehensive training on IDEA and all relevant updates?
Well, we have a training program that we do. We've been doing for about 12 years now, and we've been very successful with it. And then School Safety, which is a national organization, is actually implementing that program online next year to train lawyers, train attorneys, school attorneys, and leadership people in schools. But that won't be out till next year, but we actually do it on site, that type of training for the entire staff. You don't want to just train your leadership. You want everybody to be trained so that you prevent that liability from happening. But we do provide that. You can talk to TASA about how to secure that from us.
Okay, and then along the same lines, from Melanie, she's in the South and noticed that a lot of personnel that are working with special needs children are generalists, being supervised by a certified special education professional. Do you have any suggestions of how to begin the discussion with stress and funds strapped as tight as they are with administrators? Sometimes it feels like no lawsuit, no intention to the problem.
Well, you can't get the cart before the horse. I understand your question, but this is where this climate assessment comes in. You've got to have an assessment done of your special education department to find out why this is occurring, because I'm going to tell you something right now. Some of the most abundant grants and money that you can get from the federal government is in special education. I mean, there are literally hundreds of millions of dollars available, and it is not difficult to get. One thing that you have to get these grants now is a climate assessment that meets that federal standard of a climate assessment of your special education department. So you have to first assess why they're using generalists and not using people that are specialists. Now, that brings up a whole other issue. When I got my degree, mine is worthless now because I got it back in 1980. It was a secondary ed degree, and I think we spent 3 hours on special education. St. Joe's University outside Philadelphia, a long time ago, they were the first university in America to actually offer a dual major in education and special ed. So most people are not getting a general education bachelor's degree. If they've gotten it in the last, I'd say, 10 years or 12 years, they would have had a dual path, learning path with special ed. So the fact that they're generalists, this is another reason why you have to do an assessment, because that doesn't make sense unless these people are been in education for 30 years. But even then, most states require, and the feds require, that you have updates. And with special education, that's usually the policy. But again, that's where you need that assessment to find out, are you keeping to federal guidelines and state requirements for your training? Because it sounds to me like those generalists are violating state law. I don't know of any state that doesn't require the special ed certifications for all teachers K-12. They have to take a certain amount of that training per year. So I don't know. That sounds odd to me. So my solution to that is assess, find out what's going on. So.
Okay, and then there's a follow-up to that question as well, and this is from Ayanna. And she says, she asks, you mentioned that schools are required to do climate assessments. Is that only related to special education or the entire school environment?
Well, they use the term climate assessment to describe what you would know as a security audit or security assessment. But they use it specifically for special education. And then if you want to go after SRO money for school resource officers, if you want to go after specific grants related to school safety or emergency management grants from the federal government, you must do a security audit that meets the federal standards, and that is also known as a climate assessment. So they use that term. That's their term. It's a federal term. But we also do audits. We invented the first audit, and you can contact TASA. We've been doing them since 1989. And our audits are done by retired school superintendents, so they're done in context, and we are the only one that meets that federal standard. Not to sound like an advertisement, but you're asking a question, and it's something we offer through TASA. So feel free to talk to Carol, and we'll gladly talk to you about it. So.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Just one final question, and then we'll be able to close for the day. And here, this is interesting after that discussion. Do you think schools are too quick to issue IEPs?
No, they're too slow in doing it. But again, you know, but you have to go back before, with that question, you have to ask the question, are they trained to do it correctly and to meet the federal standards? And then we find that they delay them, they put them off, they do them improperly. So my experience would be, and we have a pretty good sampling, considering the numbers, I would say that they're slow to do them. And in case of Sandy Hook, they didn't do them at all. From what we can see, the evidence is pointing to that, allegedly. So I would say that no, they're slow to do it. They're very slow to do it. Sometimes they're doing it too. I'm willing to assume on this question, sometimes school districts have actually done them so they can get more federal money, and they are assessing students so they can get more money. And school districts that have done that have gotten caught because, contrary to popular opinion, the feds are not stupid, and they do assessments. In fact, the Justice Department has been going around with assessment teams and knock-knock warrants for the past 3 years. We've had several of our school systems audited, and they look at that and they figure it out. You start playing the game of trying to get extra money, they'll figure it out, and you're going to be in trouble. People will go to jail for that, lose their careers. So if you meant in that sense they were doing it just to get extra federal money, that happens. It's pretty rare. But in general, no, they take too long, or they don't do them at all when they should be doing them. So that would be my professional answer on that.
Okay, and Dale, there is just one more question, and I don't want to miss any of the questions.
Sure.
And
sure.
This is from Cindy. Is there a difference between a student making a threat versus actually posing a threat? Well,
it all depends on the state regarding state law. Federal law, federal law regarding IDEA outlines in very detailed terms what the threat is, type of threat, how it was presented. So you'd have to look at that to understand all those. But generally, if you make a threat, if I threaten to kill you, that's considered in many jurisdictions to be a terroristic threat, whether you're a juvenile or an adult. How it's handled is very different because the laws vary in each state. So I can't really give you a specific answer to that because everybody has different definitions of that. But it is defined in all states by state law. And, the other thing you have to remember, too, is all 50 states have a Child Welfare Act. And then in all 50 states, the departments of education for that state actually have a law that's even more intense and has higher requirements than just a general Child Welfare Act that is specifically focused on part-time and full-time employees of school systems. So they're held to a higher standard on that. And so what we see a lot of is that threats are made. No one is getting any training in how to do threat assessment, and what they do is they ignore it, and there's some type of a crime committed. Well, that's a problem because you can be charged, and school teachers, principals, school board members are being charged with not reporting it to police. And that's a very common problem where educators will hide these types of threats because they think they can help the child out. And they don't really understand criminal behavior, and they don't have the skill to understand how to distinguish between, just general children spewing things out and a specific threat. And it creates a lot of problems for everybody, so.
Okay. I think that is the end of our questions, and I want to thank you for all of your time, Dale. It was really actually very informative, and I know that we've all learned a lot today. So I'm going to ask one more time that our presenters enter in the passcode so that we have that for our CLE documentation. We are eligible for CLE credit in California, Illinois, Minnesota, Missouri, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey for this presentation. To ensure you receive your CLE credit, please complete the survey at the end of the presentation. Many states also do require this, and we also have to provide it as the accredited provider. I do know that some of our attendees today asked about specific states that aren't listed here today, and we will do our best to research those and let you know if we can provide a credit for your attendance today. Again, I want to thank Dale very much for his time. In addition, if you need another expert, please give us a call here at TASA. Please know that in addition to referring experts, we do now also offer e-discovery and document management solutions, as well as these free interactive webinars, which we do. We try to have them about twice a month. They are at no cost to our clients. And if you are looking for any kind of research reports on expert witnesses, we do have 3 different research reports. So please feel free to give us a call if you're looking for something like that. I want to thank you again for your time. Dale, thank you so much for your presentation. I know there's a lot of work that goes into these, and I do so much appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Go ahead, Dale. You can. I didn't mean.
No. I wanted to say thank you to everyone, and we would love to help you. So please contact us, and we'll help you with your needs. So.
Thank you, and that will close our presentation for today. So please do complete the survey at the end.